All right, welcome to the deep dive. You know the drill. You're here because you're curious, right?
Mhm.
You want to get to the bottom of things, and I like that. Today, we're going to try to tackle a really big question. Why is it that Eastern and Western cultures, they just often seem so fundamentally different,
Yeah, it's a question that has fascinated people for, well, probably centuries.
right? I mean, we're talking big picture stuff here, like how people see themselves. Do they focus on the individual
Mm.
or on being part of a larger group? What do they prioritize? Is it personal freedom? Is it social harmony? And it even gets down to how relationships are structured. Like,
Right.
are they more equal or do they tend to be more top down?
And we're talking really about very consistent differences that you see when you compare, say, East Asia, particularly China, with Europe and North America.
Exactly. Now, a lot of times people will try to explain these differences by pointing to things like, oh, it's because of Confucianism in the East or, the influence of ancient Greek thought in the West.
Right. And those are certainly important factors. You can't ignore them.
Of course not.
Hi.
But we're going to try to go deeper here, way deeper. We're going to look at it from a truly fundamental perspective,
Yeah.
an evolutionary perspective.
That's what makes this research so fascinating, I think.
Absolutely. We've been diving into some recent research, particularly this review and educational psychology review, and they make a really compelling argument. They're basically saying these core East-West cultural differences aren't just about philosophical ideas that sort of pops up later in history.
Right.
They're suggesting these differences actually have much, much deeper roots. They go all the way back to how populations in these different regions adapted to the specific environments they faced, over vast stretches of time.
And a lot of it boils down to this idea of environmental variability. So how much change and unpredictability did these populations experience historically in East Asia compared to Europe and North America? That seems to have had a huge impact on what kind of learning strategies became most advantageous.
Okay, so walk me through that. What do you mean by learning strategies? How does that tie into this environmental variability?
Well, think about it this way. In an environment that was relatively stable and predictable over long periods, it just made a lot of sense to learn by observing and copying others. What we call social learning.
Right. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it.
Exactly. I mean, if everyone in your village is doing something a certain way and it seems to be working, well, why reinvent the wheel? Just learn from them and do the same. But in a more, variable and unpredictable environment, where things are always changing, well, in that case, individual learning becomes much more important.
So that's where you got to figure things out yourself, trial and error kind of thing.
Exactly. Relying solely on what others have done in the past might not be enough when you're constantly facing new challenges. You have to be able to adapt and come up with novel solutions.
Okay, so we've got these two basic learning strategies: social learning, copying others, and individual learning, figuring things out on your own. Now, I'm assuming this isn't just based on like one study, right? This research draws on a pretty wide range of evidence.
Oh, absolutely. This review pulls together all sorts of stuff: historical evidence, findings from cross-cultural psychology, research in educational psychology,
Mhm.
looking at how different cultures approach learning, even some evolutionary biology thrown in there for good measure. It's really impressive.
All right, so our mission today, our deep dive, if you will, is to try to really understand these ultimate evolutionary forces that have shaped these cultural differences.
Yeah.
We're talking about differences that often seem so deeply ingrained. It's like East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet.
Right, right.
But we're going to try to see if we can get to that aha moment where it all clicks, where you suddenly understand why these broad East-West patterns emerged. And it wasn't just by chance. There's a deep logic to it all, a logic of adaptation.
A deep logic of adaptation. I like that.
So where do we start? Where do we even begin to unravel this?
Well, I think a good place to start is with the human mind itself. How has the mind evolved to deal with information and make decisions? And the research suggests that we actually have a couple of different systems for doing this.
Two different systems, almost like different gears in our mental machinery.
That's a great analogy, yeah. Think of it like that. You've got one system, often called System 1, that's fast, it's intuitive, and it relies heavily on mental shortcuts, or what we call heuristics. Think of these like specialized tools that evolved early on to deal with specific recurring problems in a very efficient way.
Okay, so like a mental Swiss Army knife. Each tool designed for a particular job.
Exactly. And the jobs these tools were designed for are things that were absolutely crucial for survival in our evolutionary past. For example, we seem to have this built-in social contract module that's incredibly good at detecting when someone is trying to cheat in a social exchange.
So we're hardwired to spot freeloaders.
In a way, yes. There's some fascinating research where they give people these abstract logic problems and they really struggle with them. But when they reframe those exact same problems in terms of social fairness, like making sure that someone who benefits also pays the cost, well, suddenly people's reasoning becomes incredibly sharp. It's like this switch flips, and it suggests we have this really deep-seated sensitivity to social reciprocity.
We want to make sure everyone's pulling their weight.
Right. Another great example is what's called Kithkin rationality.
Kithkin rationality.
Yeah, it refers to this ingrained way of thinking about and treating people differently depending on whether they're part of our immediate group, our kith and kin, or whether they're outsiders.
Right.
And this probably evolved back when humans lived in smaller, more tightly knit communities.
Us versus them.
Exactly. And there are studies using scenarios like what they call the Asian disease problem.
Asian disease problem.
Yeah, it's this hypothetical scenario where people have to make decisions about saving lives during an outbreak, right? And the researchers manipulate how they frame the size and the nature of the affected group, like whether it feels more like your close kin or more like this larger, more anonymous population. And what they find is that even these subtle changes in framing can actually shift people's risk preferences in a way that suggests these deep-seated cognitive modules are at work.
Interesting. So our brains are kind of pre-programmed to think about us and them in certain ways.
It seems that way, yeah.
Okay, so that's system one, these quick, specialized responses. Now, you said there were two systems.
Right. So system two, this is a bit more of a recent evolutionary development. It's slower, it's more deliberate, and it's much more rule-based. But crucially, it's also more flexible.
Flexible.
Yeah. Meaning that it can be applied to a wider range of new and unfamiliar problems, things that we haven't necessarily evolved specific modules for. And system two relies heavily on our executive functions, things like attention and working memory. And this is where general intelligence comes in, our ability to reason abstractly, solve novel problems, things like that.
Okay, so system two is kind of like the heavy-duty thinking we do when we encounter something truly new or complex, something that doesn't have a ready-made solution in our mental Swiss Army knife.
Precisely. And here's where it all ties back into the environment. So the theory suggests that the level of environmental variability a population experiences, meaning, how consistent or how constantly changing the information patterns around them are, that this has actually influenced which of these two systems is more important and how much each system has developed over time.
So how does environmental stability, how does that favor one system over the other?
Okay, well, imagine a population that's living in an environment that's basically the same day after day, generation after generation. The challenges they face, the solutions that work, they remain pretty constant.
Like farming in a region with very predictable seasons?
Exactly. In that kind of environment, there's just not as much pressure to develop this highly flexible, effortful system too. It's expensive in terms of brain power. Instead, evolution would likely favor the refinement of those quick, efficient System 1 modules that are really good at dealing with those predictable patterns.
Right, if you know what to expect, if you're facing the same issues over and over again, having that fast, automatic response is going to be a lot more efficient than having to stop and consciously think everything through from scratch.
Exactly. Now flip that script. Imagine a population that's living in a much more heterogeneous and variable environment where you're constantly encountering new and unpredictable situations.
So more like hunter-gatherers in an environment with unpredictable weather patterns and resource availability.
Precisely. Now, in that kind of environment, having that adaptable system too, that becomes a major advantage. The ability to learn, innovate, to adjust your behavior to those changing circumstances, that's going to be much more valuable for survival and success than just relying on your ingrained responses.
Okay, so that makes sense. Now, what kinds of things create this environmental variability?
Yeah.
You talked about like weather earlier, but it sounds like it's a lot broader than just that.
It's much broader, yeah. The research we're looking at, they consider all sorts of factors. You've got the physical environment, things like climate, natural disasters, all of that. But then you've also got the social environment, and this is huge. How do people interact? What's the level of competition? How much cooperation is there? What's the structure of their political systems? How stable are those systems?
So you could imagine like a long-lasting unified government. That might create a more stable social environment than a region with, constantly shifting political boundaries and lots of conflict.
Exactly. And all of these things feed into this idea of environmental variability.
Okay, so let's connect this back to learning. At the most basic level, learning is just about figuring out how to interact with the environment, right?
Oh.
And you mentioned there are these two main ways that humans do this. Social learning, where we copy others, and individual learning, where we kind of have to figure things out on our own.
And both are important, but their relative importance depends on, you guessed it, environmental variability.
Right, so back to that idea.
Yeah.
Now, in a stable environment, social learning is super powerful. It's efficient. Why waste time and energy, potentially make mistakes, trying to figure something out when you could just learn from the people around you who already have a solution that works?
Right.
It's like if your neighbor figured out the best way to irrigate their crops during a dry season, it makes a lot more sense to just copy what they're doing than to try a bunch of different things and risk losing your whole harvest.
That's a great example. But now imagine the climate starts to change. Those dry seasons become more frequent, more severe. Suddenly, your neighbor's old methods might not work anymore. That's when individual learning becomes more valuable.
You got to experiment. You got to find new solutions. You got to adapt.
Right. And over time, these dominant ways of learning shaped by the environment, they can actually become deeply embedded in a culture.
Okay, so it becomes more than just a strategy. It starts to shape how an entire society thinks and behaves.
Exactly. When a particular learning style, whether it's a strong reliance on social learning or a greater emphasis on individual learning, when that consistently leads to successful adaptation in a particular environment, it can become a cultural norm. It starts to influence everything, how children are raised, how people organize themselves into groups, what they value, you name it.
Okay, so that's the big picture. That's the framework. But let's get into the specifics. What's the evidence that there were these actual differences in environmental variability between East Asia and Europe and North America? How do we know this wasn't just, a matter of chance?
That's the really interesting part. The researchers break it down into 6 key areas where they find evidence for greater historical environmental variability in Europe and North America compared to East Asia, especially China.
6 key areas, all right? Lay it on me. What's number one?
First up is latitude and climate. Higher latitude regions, just by their nature, tend to experience more variability in their climate.
So we're talking temperature swings, rainfall, things like that.
Exactly. And Europe, being at generally higher latitudes than much of East Asia, particularly China, historically they just experienced much more significant swings in temperature, in rainfall, more severe weather events, major storms, droughts, periods of famine, even some periods with a higher frequency of earthquakes compared to China.
I wouldn't have immediately thought of the link between latitude and something like earthquakes.
Yeah, it's not about the earthquakes themselves. It's about the overall unpredictability. And even something as basic as the amount of daylight, that changes much more dramatically throughout the year at higher latitudes.
Right.
Someone living in Northern Europe is going to experience a much starker difference between those long summer days and those short winter days than someone living in, say, southern China.
And the research you were talking about, they actually point out that for early humans, who originated in more equatorial regions, that moving to higher latitudes was a huge challenge in itself.
Absolutely. It was a novel environment. It required new adaptations. They had to deal with things like temperature extremes and much more pronounced seasonal changes, things that just weren't necessary in their ancestral environments. So the climatic conditions in Europe were, on average, historically more variable, and they presented a whole set of new challenges that people in East Asia just didn't have to face.
Okay, that makes sense. So that's climate. What's the second area where they see these differences?
This one has to do with political structures. They talk about the difference between political unity and plurality.
Unity versus plurality.
Right. So China, for example, has this incredibly long history of relatively centralized government and political unity. I mean, it goes all the way back over 2,000 years to the Qin dynasty. And, of course, they've had periods of internal division, but the overall pattern has been these large, unified empires with a single ruling power. And a big part of that is that they've had a relatively consistent written language for much of their history. That makes a big difference in terms of communication and administration.
Which creates a more predictable social environment, right?
Yeah.
If you know the laws and the general expectations are going to be the same across a large territory, that makes things a lot more stable.
Exactly. Now compare that to Europe. You had that brief period of the Roman Empire, but after that, it's been a very different story. Europe has this much longer history of being fragmented. You've got all these smaller political entities, kingdoms, duchies, city-states. They're constantly forming, dissolving, shifting alliances. It's a much more dynamic, fluid landscape. And of course, you have a much greater diversity of languages developing in Europe.
So in Europe, even the political and social landscape itself is much more variable, more unpredictable.
Absolutely. You've got different legal systems, different rulers, different cultural norms emerging and interacting, often in very close geographical proximity. It's just this constant state of flux, and that creates a much more variable social environment.
Okay, that's a great contrast. What's the third area?
This one is migration.
Migration. So how did migration patterns differ in a way that would affect this idea of variability?
Well, historically, China has had these relatively stable frontier zones. They haven't had the same kind of continuous expansion and these waves of migration that you see in European history.
Right. All those migrations and invasions that shaped Europe. That makes sense.
And it's not just that. Many Chinese dynasties actually implemented really strict systems of household registration, and they placed limitations on internal movement, to control the population. People often needed official permission to travel beyond their immediate locality.
Wow. So it was harder to just pick up and move somewhere else.
Yeah, much harder. And that, of course, created a more settled, a less mobile population overall.
And that's a very different picture from, the waves of migration and exploration that are such a big part of Western history. Think of the Greeks, the Romans, the Vikings, the age of exploration. It's just constant movement.
Exactly. And in Europe, you generally had much freer movement of people, both within the continent and, of course, outward exploration, colonization, all of that led to significant immigration. And that, of course, leads to greater population diversity, which introduces even more variability, in terms of social interactions, cultural norms, and so on. The research actually cites some statistics from 2005 showing that the percentage of people living outside their birth country was significantly higher in Europe and North America compared to East Asia, and the net migration rates were also very different.
Okay, so more movement, more mixing, more diversity, which all feeds into this idea of a more variable environment. Makes sense. What's number 4 on the list?
Number 4 is warfare.
Warfare. Yeah, it seems pretty obvious that frequent conflict would create a very variable, very unpredictable environment.
Absolutely. And historically, Europe has experienced more frequent and more extensive interstate wars than East Asia. There are a bunch of studies that have looked at this, comparing the number and duration of wars in these two regions.
Wow. And of course, war has such a huge impact on everything, right? I mean, you think about the disruption of trade, the rise and fall of different powers, the introduction of new technologies and ideas, sometimes through conflict.
Right, it just throws everything up in the air.
And even the way that different cultures approach war can be very different, right?
Mm.
The research actually contrasts some of the defensive military strategies you see in China,
Mm.
like the Great Wall, with the more outward-focused, exploration and expansion that you see in European powers.
Right, which again suggests, different ways of adapting to the perceived threats and opportunities in their respective environments.
Okay, so we're 4 for 4. More variability in climate, in political structures, in migration patterns, and in warfare in Europe compared to East Asia. What's number 5?
Number 5 is agriculture.
Ag culture.
Yeah.
Interesting. Now, how do you think agricultural practices would play into this idea of environmental stability versus variability?
Well, think about China. They have this very, very long history of primarily land-based, family-focused agriculture.
Right.
And that way of life, it tends to, well, it kind of roots you, right? It limits geographical mobility. You're tied to your land. And it also results in fewer large-scale environmental changes compared to, more industrialized or diversified economies. There's just less disruption, less change.
And the reliance on the seasons, on these natural cycles, that
Yeah.
creates its own kind of predictability, right? You know what to expect year after year.
Right, exactly. Now, in Europe, while agriculture was certainly important, there was also more diversity historically in terms of how people made a living. You had nomadic pastoralism, you had more developed animal husbandry, all of which involved greater movement, greater interaction with different environments. And then, of course, you have the Industrial Revolution, which was this massive shift away from agriculture,
Yeah.
leading to really significant social and economic change, more variability. The research actually compares urbanization rates over time, and you can see that Europe had a higher proportion of its population living in cities much earlier than China. That just indicates a greater diversification of livelihoods, more social interaction, more going on.
More mixing, more change.
Exactly. And even the way that, land ownership was structured was different. You had the feudal manor system in Europe with this more defined division of labor and more reliance on trade, which contrasts with that more self-sufficient, family-based agricultural model that you see in China.
Okay, so that's agriculture. We've got one more area to cover. What's the sixth factor they look at?
This one's a bit less obvious, but it has to do with pathogens.
Pathogens,
Yeah.
diseases. I'm not sure I see the connection to environmental variability.
Yeah, this one's a bit counterintuitive. The logic here is that a consistently high prevalence of pathogens in an environment might actually correlate with lower variability in other aspects of that environment.
Okay, I'm listening.
Well, think about it. If a particular disease is always a significant threat, it creates this constant pressure, right? And that might actually make other fluctuating environmental factors seem less impactful by comparison. And this is especially true when you're talking about health, right? The cost of experimenting and making mistakes when it comes to disease can be very high. So in those kinds of environments, you might actually see a stronger preference for just sticking with established socially learned practices for avoiding illness.
So if disease is a constant backdrop, other changes might seem less important, and you'd be more inclined to just do what everyone else does to stay healthy.
That's part of the thinking, yeah. And the research we're looking at, they cite some studies suggesting that both historically and even in the present day, China, being located at lower latitudes, has tended to have a higher prevalence of certain pathogens compared to Europe.
Oh, interesting.
They even present some historical and contemporary data supporting this, and this higher chronic pathogen load in the East could have indirectly contributed to a greater reliance on social learning, on following those established health practices, and a lower perceived need for individual experimentation in that really crucial domain.
Okay, so when we take all six of these areas together, climate, political structure, migration patterns, warfare, agriculture, and pathogens, the evidence does seem to point toward a historically more stable and predictable environment in much of East Asia, especially China, compared to, the greater variability and dynamism of Europe and North America. And as you've been explaining, the central argument is that this key difference, that this shaped the development of these different dominant learning styles.
Exactly. Relatively stable information patterns in the East that would have favored social learning, efficiently adopting those successful behaviors to deal with those recurring challenges. Whereas those more changing and unpredictable patterns in the West, those would have favored individual learning, being able to innovate and adapt to those novel situations.
And it's almost like these adaptations then become self-reinforcing, right? I mean, the research even touches on that, like a stable agricultural system, for example, that leads to more settled populations, which leads to stronger social networks, which then further encourages social learning.
It's a feedback loop. Once a particular way of adapting becomes culturally ingrained and it's successful, well, that can actually help to maintain the very conditions that favored its development in the first place.
It's like this self-perpetuating cycle.
Right.
Okay, so now, if we follow this logic, if East Asian cultures historically experienced these more stable environments that favored social learning, we should see that reflected in how they approach learning and education.
Right. That's exactly what the research suggests.
Okay, so let's dive into that. What kinds of differences do we see?
Well, the cross-cultural research that compares, Eastern and Western approaches to education, it reveals some really fundamental differences, not just in teaching methods, but in how students and teachers, how they view the whole learning process itself.
So it goes deeper than just, different techniques in the classroom.
Much deeper, yeah. For example, there are studies that have looked at the beliefs about learning that are held by, say, American students versus Chinese students.
Interesting. And what do they find?
Well, American students, they often emphasize things like critical thinking, being able to ask questions, to explore ideas independently, that kind of learning by doing approach.
Okay.
Chinese students, on the other hand, they tend to define learning more in terms of memorization, very carefully following instructions, and just putting in a lot of effort, being diligent. They also place a really high value on having an excellent memory, being able to just recall facts and details accurately.
Right, so that really aligns with the idea of social learning, right? Absorb and replicate existing knowledge.
Exactly. Whereas the American emphasis on questioning and that more independent thought, that sounds a lot more like individual exploration.
Yeah, totally.
And this difference also extends to how students view their teachers. So Asian students generally show a much greater degree of deference and respect for teachers. They see them as these authoritative figures, as sources of this established knowledge.
Okay.
And you shouldn't question your teachers. Western students, I mean, they certainly respect their teachers, but they might be a lot more inclined to, engage in debate, challenge ideas presented to them.
Yeah, definitely. I've seen that in my own kids.
It's a cultural difference. And this more, I guess you could say, compliant approach in the East, well, that really facilitates social learning.
Right. You're more willing to just accept and internalize the information the teacher is giving you if you see them as this sort of unquestionable authority.
Yeah.
And the research on memorization and rote learning, that seems pretty consistent across a lot of different studies, right?
Yeah, very consistent. You see this greater emphasis on memorization in Eastern education, particularly in subjects like mathematics. Rote memorization of multiplication tables, formulas, key facts, that's just standard practice. And when you ask students about their preferred learning styles, which subjects do they like, a much higher percentage of East Asian students, they'll often report preferring those subjects that rely more on memorization compared to subjects that require more problem solving or independent analysis. They also tend to believe that repeated practice and memorization, that this is the key to really understanding the material.
So drill it in until it sticks.
Basically.
Mhm.
Whereas Western students often say the opposite. They prefer those subjects where they can be more active, solve problems, have discussions. The research also mentions this interesting difference.
What's that?
It's about note-taking.
Oh, right.
So Asian students, they tend to prefer teachers who provide really detailed notes, the very structured outlines.
Okay.
Whereas Western students often prefer those teachers who encourage more classroom debate and discussion. And that's a pretty big contrast, right?
Yeah, in terms of what they expect from the learning process.
And that highlights this deeper difference in how they see the roles of the teacher and the student. In the East, the teacher is often seen as the transmitter of knowledge.
The sage on the stage.
Right, exactly. And the student's role is to just diligently receive and internalize that knowledge.
Be the sponge.
Exactly. In the West, there's often a greater emphasis on the student actively constructing their own understanding through inquiry and critical thinking.
The guide on the side.
That's a great way to put it.
And it's interesting, even in how young children learn something as basic as, math, you see these cultural differences.
Oh, absolutely. There was this research comparing how American and Chinese children learn basic addition, just adding numbers together.
Yeah.
And what they found was that Chinese children, they tend to shift to just retrieving the fact. They just memorize the answers to those simple addition problems.
Oh, interesting.
And they do this much earlier and more effectively than American children. American kids tend to rely more on counting strategies for a longer period.
Okay.
So again, that suggests this stronger emphasis on rote memorization in that Eastern learning style. And it's not just about the students either. The way teaching itself is organized and approached, that differs quite a bit too.
How so?
We'll take mathematics teaching in China, for example.
Okay.
They often emphasize these very standardized teaching methods, a very standardized curriculum. There's this real push for uniformity, how lessons are structured and delivered. And they have these things called teaching preparation groups. Have you heard of these?
No, what are those?
It's where teachers get together and they collaborate on lesson plans.
Oh,
And the goal is to make sure there's consistency, that everyone is sharing best practices, all of that. And then they often have this mentor-apprentice system as well,
okay.
where the less experienced teachers, they basically learn by just closely following those established methods used by, more experienced colleagues.
Right. So it's very much a system built around transmitting these, established effective techniques.
Exactly. And that fits perfectly with that social learning model. Whereas in America, there's generally much more emphasis on encouraging those individual teaching styles and on fostering independent thinking, creativity in the student.
Right. Different goals, different methods.
And even the amount of direct instruction in the classroom, that seems to differ quite a bit too.
Yeah, so.
Well, there have been these observational studies where they actually go into the classrooms and they watch what's happening.
Okay.
And what they found is that Asian classrooms, they typically have a much higher percentage of classroom time dedicated to teacher-directed instruction, lectures, large group activities, whereas in American classrooms, there's often more time allocated for independent work, small group projects, those less structured activities.
So it's like in the Eastern classrooms, it's all about efficiently conveying this shared body of knowledge.
Right.
And in the Western classrooms, it's more about that individual exploration and discovery.
That's a great way to summarize it, yeah. And the research even suggests that, Asian teachers, they might be less inclined to encourage, highly creative or unconventional behaviors in students. They might prioritize conformity, compliance with those established norms and expectations.
Okay.
And there's even some evidence that Chinese students might be less willing to just try different answers or to guess when they're unsure, which again might reflect that greater emphasis on being accurate, on adhering to what they've been explicitly taught.
All right. So it really does seem like the learning styles and the educational practices, they do support this idea that social learning is more prevalent in the East and individual learning is more emphasized in the West. Now, the final piece of this puzzle, this has to do with personality.
Personality, yeah.
So if these different learning strategies have been favored for such a long time, you would expect to see some corresponding differences in personality traits, or I mean, the kinds of traits that are more common in each culture.
That's the idea. Evolutionary pressures would likely favor those personality traits that support the dominant learning strategy in a given environment.
Makes sense. So which traits are we talking about here?
Well, let's start with conformity and compliance. Those seem like they'd be super important for effective social learning, right?
Right, because if you're mostly learning by observing and imitating other people, you've got to be willing to, you know, go along with the group, to do what everyone else is doing.
Exactly. And there's a lot of research on this. One of the classic ways to measure conformity is this thing called the Ash conformity task. Have you heard of this one?
Yeah, that's the one where, like, they show you lines of different lengths and they ask you to pick the one that matches, right?
Right. But here's the trick. They put you in a group and everyone else in the group is in on it.
They're all giving the wrong answer.
Exactly. And they want to see if you